The Galactic Empire didn't fall because it was weak, it fell because of how it tried to be strong. For 24 years, the Empire ruled through fear, and that fear kept most of the galaxy in line. Then one day, the Emperor perished at the hands of his own apprentice, and everything fell apart. But the collapse didn't begin at Endor, it began long before that, long before anyone fired a single shot. And once you see the pattern, you'll understand why the Empire was never going to survive, no matter how many Death Stars it built. What really brought down the Empire wasn't luck, and it wasn't the rebellion. The systems meant to preserve Imperial power failed when they mattered most. Their strategies created more enemies than they removed. Their leadership structures left them unable to see threats until it was too late. What emerges from this history is not a story of rebel heroism, but of an empire that engineered its own collapse. The evidence is scattered across both canon and legends, and when you piece it together, the conclusion becomes impossible to ignore. The Empire's first mistake was simple. It never understood what kind of conflict it was fighting. This wasn't a failure of resources or intelligence, it was a failure of imagination, and it influenced every decision that followed. The Galactic Civil War was not a standard military conflict despite its name. Imperial forces weren't facing a single enemy army on a single battlefield. They were trying to control an entire galaxy filled with thousands of worlds spread across vast distances. Each world had its own people, its own problems, and its own reasons to resent outside rule. The rebels didn't need to win battles, they only needed to survive long enough to grow. Every month they continued to exist was a victory, and every harsh Imperial response handed them new supporters. Imperial leadership saw the rebellion as a policing problem. From their view, these were troublemakers who could be crushed with enough military power. Build enough Star Destroyers, station enough stormtroopers, punish dissent harshly enough, and the problem would solve itself. This thinking shaped every major Imperial decision. But the Empire tried to rule the galaxy like you rule a prison, and a galaxy isn't a prison. You cannot lock down thousands of worlds, watch trillions of beings, or punish everyone who might resist. There will always be gaps, always be places where Imperial authority is thin, always be people willing to take advantage of those gaps. The rebellion found every single one of them. The rebels understood something Imperial leadership never did. This was a contest for hearts across thousands of worlds, where military actions mattered mostly for their political effects. Every victory showed that Palpatine's regime could be challenged, that its forces could be beaten, that hope was not foolish. A single X-Wing taking down a TIE fighter didn't shift the balance of power, but that story spreading across 100 systems could shift everything. The rebellion wasn't trying to outfight the Empire, it was trying to outlast it while growing stronger as its enemy grew weaker. The rebellion needed people willing to hide them, feed them, share what they knew, and join the cause. A government that turns its population into enemies is fighting with one hand tied behind its back. Yet, instead of building trust, Palpatine's regime relied on terror. Instead of earning loyalty, it demanded obedience. Fear became the Empire's answer to everything, and that answer didn't just fail to stop the rebellion, it actively fed it, turning more people against the regime with every crackdown. The Empire's reliance on fear didn't prevent resistance, it created resistance. Every act of harsh treatment pushed more ordinary people towards the rebellion. The strategy meant to end the conflict was making it worse, and Imperial leadership couldn't see it happening. The elimination of Alderaan shows this most clearly. Grand Moff Tarkin intended it as a warning so terrible that no one would dare resist. Remove a planet known for sympathizing with rebels, and the galaxy would learn that harboring them meant annihilation. In A New Hope, Tarkin states that fear will keep the local systems in line. He expects submission, he gets the opposite. Alderaan's fate stirred resistance across the galaxy and turned the Organa family into powerful symbols of the freedom struggle. Countless beings joined the Alliance specifically because an entire world had been eliminated. The rebellion gained more recruits in the weeks after Alderaan than it had in years of previous efforts. People who had stayed neutral suddenly picked a side. The message Alderaan sent to the galaxy was unmistakable. Alderaan was not a military power. It was known for diplomacy, culture, and peaceful traditions. It had no fleet threatening Imperial shipping and no army preparing for war. Princess Leia was a member of the Imperial Senate, a position that should have granted protection under Imperial law. Yet the planet was eliminated anyway, not because it posed a threat, but because it was useful for making a point. If this could happen to peaceful, cooperative Alderaan, it could happen to anyone. The Death Star didn't scare the galaxy into obedience, it taught the galaxy there was no safe middle ground anymore. Before Alderaan, keeping your head down seemed the safest path. Stay quiet, follow the rules, don't attract attention, and maybe you'd be left alone. After Alderaan, that reasoning fell apart. For those who might be terminated anyway, even after following every rule and never causing trouble, resistance no longer seemed like the greater risk. This breakdown in faith played out among Imperial personnel themselves. In Lost Stars, 2 officers witness Alderaan's end from different positions. Thane Kyrell, a TIE pilot assigned to the Death Star, watches the planet dissolve into debris. He cannot make sense of what he has seen. Billions of lives, an entire culture, an entire history gone in an instant. He had joined the Imperial Navy believing it brought order and stability to a chaotic galaxy. Alderaan shatters that belief completely. The Empire's vision of order includes eliminating entire worlds for political convenience. The ideals he thought he was serving didn't exist. Thane eventually defects to the rebellion, bringing with him every skill and piece of knowledge his training had given him. His flight experience, his tactical knowledge, and his understanding of Imperial procedures and weaknesses now serve the enemy. Sienna Ree, his former friend, remains with the Empire, bound by an oath she cannot break. But her faith is shattered. She serves a government she no longer believes in, going through the motions while knowing the truth. Officers like her, still in uniform but hollowed out inside, were everywhere in the Imperial military after Alderaan. They followed orders, but their hearts weren't in it. Palpatine's regime wasn't just creating external enemies, it was turning its own soldiers into rebel fighters or into empty uniforms waiting for the chance to walk away. At ground level, resistance often formed not through grand ideals, but through the lived experience of Imperial rule. Endor depicts this process in detail, showing how ordinary people became rebels, one small injustice at a time. This cycle repeated itself across the galaxy. After the Aldani heist in Season 1, the crackdown sweeps up thousands who had nothing to do with it. Cassian Andor receives a 6-year sentence for essentially nothing. His offense being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Prison camps became recruiting grounds for the very resistance they were meant to crush. On worlds like Ferrix, Imperial mining operations emptied resources while giving nothing back, and local traditions became acts of resistance simply because they represented something that hadn't been approved. Communities that had survived for generations watched their environments ruined, their young people forced into Imperial facilities, and their identities erased in the name of order. Every act of harshness turned neutral people into helpers, informants, and fighters. The rebellion didn't create these grievances, it organized them. The anger was already there, waiting to be channeled. Imperial leadership had spent years building it up, one injustice at a time. By the time anyone at the top noticed the problem growing, it had already spread far beyond what simple force could contain. But that realization came slowly, because something else was happening inside the chain of command. The people at the top were losing their ability to see reality clearly. The Empire wasn't just losing ground across the galaxy, it was losing something far more dangerous to lose: the ability to understand what was happening in the first place. The same fear that was supposed to maintain order was corrupting the information leadership needed to respond. When your entire chain of command is terrified, your empire goes blind. In any system where bad news gets you punished, bad news stops being reported. Officers learn to compete on loyalty rather than results. Mistakes stayed hidden until they became disasters. Promotions rewarded political skill over actual performance. If your patrol found evidence of rebel activity, maybe it was better not to mention it. If your sector was experiencing unrest, maybe it was better to describe it as minor disturbances. If your mission failed, maybe it was better to frame it as a partial success. It didn't take long for everyone to learn what kind of reports were welcome. Officers who told Palpatine or Vader what they wanted to hear rose through the ranks. Officers who told them unwelcome truths were punished, demoted, or removed. Over time, the chain of command became a machine for filtering out accurate information and promoting comfortable lies. Each level cleaned up the reports before passing them upward. By the time information reached the top, it had been changed so many times that it barely resembled reality. The consequences of failure were severe and public. In The Empire Strikes Back, Admiral Ozzel comes out of hyperspace too close to Hoth, alerting the rebels, and Vader ends him right there on the bridge. Captain Nita loses track of the Millennium Falcon in an asteroid field and meets the same fate. The message to every other officer in the fleet was unmistakable. Failure didn't mean demotion or reassignment, it meant death. This created a command structure where appearing competent mattered more than being competent. Officers spent more energy managing perceptions than managing threats. Resources went towards projects that made superiors happy rather than projects that addressed real problems. The safest career move was always to follow the officer above you, even when that officer was wrong. Initiative became dangerous. Innovation became suspicious. The entire system rewarded those who did exactly what they were told and punished those who tried to do what actually needed to be done. The Imperial Security Bureau shows how this played out in practice. Endor depicts the ISB as an organization that was supposed to be the Empire's eyes and ears, dedicated to rooting out rebellion and maintaining internal security. Instead, it became a nest of competing officers more focused on each other than on the actual enemy. Major Partagaz, a senior ISB officer, warns Supervisor Dedra Meero after she succeeds in her investigations. He doesn't congratulate her, he doesn't praise her work, he tells her to watch her back. Her success makes her threatening to colleagues who will work against her. In the ISB, being good at your job makes you a target. Meero is genuinely capable, perhaps the most skilled ISB officer in the series. She correctly identifies that seemingly random incidents are actually coordinated rebel operations across multiple sectors. She sees connections others have missed. She understands that someone is organizing these cells, funding them, and directing them towards meaningful targets. This is exactly the kind of work the ISB should be doing. Her superiors dismiss her findings and tell her not to overstep. Supervisor Blevin accuses her of overreach, not because she's wrong, but because her investigation crosses into his territory. Protecting his turf matters more than protecting the Empire. A rebellion thrives on slow reactions and poor coordination. The Empire provided both in abundance. By the time the leadership finally reacted to any threat, the situation on the ground had already moved past the point where simple force could fix it. Palpatine's regime was now creating enemies it couldn't see through a structure that was about to make everything worse. The Empire's structure made it powerful but fragile. Everything centered on one emperor, one main chain of command issuing orders, and rigid rules that punished independent thinking. Local leaders had little freedom to adapt to local conditions. Everything flowed up to the top, where decisions were made, and then flowed back down as orders to be followed without question. The rebels were flexible. The Empire was a single giant machine, and big machines don't turn fast. This wasn't an accident. It was Palpatine's choice, and it made perfect sense from his perspective. A looser empire with capable, independent governors would have been stronger against outside threats. It would have adapted faster, responded better to local conditions, and made smarter decisions at every level. But it also would have been more threatening to Palpatine personally. Independent power centers create potential rivals. Governors with their own forces, economic bases, and public support could challenge his authority. They could build alliances with each other. They could develop their own ambitions. The Clone Wars had shown what happened when regional powers built up too much strength. Palpatine had used exactly that kind of breakdown to seize power in the first place. He wasn't about to let it happen to him, so he chose his own safety over the Empire's strength. Every design choice that made the regime more dependent on him personally made it more fragile as an institution. He was building a system that couldn't threaten him, which meant building a system that couldn't function without him. The end of the Imperial Senate, depicted in A New Hope, removed a potential check on his power. It also eliminated an institution that might have provided some continuity after his passing, some framework for choosing a successor, and some process for resolving disputes among Imperial leaders. With the Senate gone, there was nothing. No way to pick a new emperor, no way to settle conflicts between ambitious Moffs, no shared understanding of what the Empire should become after Palpatine. If there was any doubt that Palpatine designed the Empire to collapse without him, Operation Cinder removes it completely. This backup plan, depicted in Star Wars Battlefront 2 and detailed across the Aftermath trilogy, shows that the regime was designed to punish the galaxy when Palpatine fell. Not to preserve itself, not to continue his work, not to maintain order or protect Imperial citizens, to punish. When the Emperor perished at Endor, messenger droids activated across the galaxy. They sought out specific Imperial officers and delivered final orders. Devastate targeted planets using weather-changing technology, burn away any ideas that could not be allowed to continue, scorch the worlds and leave them ash. This wasn't a plan for Imperial survival, this was revenge. If Palpatine couldn't have the galaxy, he would make sure no one else could either. The target list is the most telling part. Strikes were directed not only at rebel-aligned worlds, but at loyal Imperial worlds as well. Naboo, Palpatine's own home world, the place where his rise to power began, was targeted. Vardos, whose population had faithfully served for decades and produced some of the most dedicated soldiers, was targeted too. These weren't enemies. These were some of the most loyal subjects in the entire Empire. If Palpatine couldn't rule the galaxy, no one would. The rebellion, by contrast, was built completely differently. Remove a rebel base, and survivors scattered to other bases. Remove a rebel leader, and other leaders stepped forward. There was no single point of failure. No one person whose end would stop the movement. The network was designed to survive losing any piece of itself, because the people who built it knew they would lose pieces along the way. The Empire was a power structure that collapsed when its head was removed. There was no agreed-upon successor, no ability to adapt, and no memory of how to function without direct orders from above. A machine that broke into pieces the moment it lost its operator. And instead of investing in something more flexible, something that could survive pressure, Imperial leadership had poured resources into a project that made all these problems worse. The Death Star wasn't just a battle station, it was a shortcut, a way of avoiding the hard work of really governing. And like most shortcuts, it made things worse in ways that weren't obvious until it was too late. One superweapon can't replace public trust, good intelligence, and local stability. The station drained budget, talent, secrecy, and attention. It encouraged the belief that eliminating one planet would solve everything. Resources that went into the Death Star couldn't go anywhere else. Those same resources could have built regular fleets, established effective bases, or invested in governance that earned public support rather than demanding it at blaster point. The Death Star was designed as an active threat, a way to inflict punishment until targets did what Palpatine's regime wanted. Tarkin saw it as the key to crushing dissent, believing fear of a planet-eliminating station would keep systems in line. But the approach had a basic flaw that Tarkin never addressed. There was no clear target for that kind of force. The rebellion had no central authority that could be threatened into surrender. There was no capital to hold hostage, no government that could sign a peace treaty, and no single leader whose defeat would end the fight. The rebellion was everywhere and nowhere, a network of cells and supporters spread across thousands of worlds. Eliminate Yavin 4 after the rebel fleet escaped, and survivors simply scattered to 100 other bases. A station that could obliterate worlds was useless against an enemy with no world it couldn't afford to lose. You can't force surrender from an enemy that has no one allowed to surrender. The Death Star's construction actively created the rebellion it was meant to stop. As revealed in Catalyst, the project demanded resources on a scale the galaxy had never seen before. Mines were established across the galaxy, taking everything from industrial metals to the rare kyber crystals of Jedha. Entire regions were stripped of their resources. Entire populations were displaced or pressed into service. Imperial forces viewed kyber crystals purely as tools for harm. Sacred sites that had been maintained for thousands of years were stripped bare. Crystal formations that communities had protected for generations were shattered. Ancient Jedi temples were demolished to get at the crystals within. Communities that had coexisted peacefully with these places for thousands of years found them gone overnight, replaced by industrial wreckage and Imperial guards. Galen Erso, a scientist who had devoted his life to studying kyber crystals and their potential for clean energy, was tricked into working on the station's main firing system. He believed his research was going towards a project that would help people, that would bring power to worlds that it lacked. Instead, his work was twisted into something devastating. When he discovered the truth, he built in a hidden weakness, a flaw that would eventually allow the rebellion to bring down the station. That sabotage cost him his life, but it gave the rebellion the opening it needed. The Death Star's very construction drove people into the arms of rebel cells. People who had never cared about galactic politics became rebels because everything had been taken from them. They had lost their homes, their livelihoods, their sacred places, and their futures. The station meant to end the rebellion was funding it through the suffering its construction caused. Every mine created resentment. Every displaced community created potential recruits. Every demolished temple created people with nothing left to lose. And while the Death Star bled the galaxy dry, it was also serving the Empire's own military from the inside. Grand Admiral Thrawn's TIE Defender project, which would have given Imperial forces a major advantage in fighter combat, was repeatedly pushed aside in favor of Death Star construction. Those resources could have built hundreds of Star Destroyers, thousands of fighters, and created an actual increase in the ability to project power across the entire galaxy at once. Instead, everything was concentrated in one location, one station, one project that could be ended with a single, well-placed shot. When the first Death Star fell at Yavin, the Empire lost more than a single station. It lost the resources of 100 fleets, the expertise of countless engineers, and everything else those resources could have built. The response reveals how deep this dependence ran. Rather than learning from the failure, rather than trying a different approach, Imperial leadership built a second Death Star, twice the size, twice the power, twice the investment, doubling down on a failed approach rather than trying something new. And even if the second Death Star had survived, it wouldn't have mattered. The galaxy was simply too vast to control through force alone. The galaxy's sheer size defeated the Empire's approach. No military force, no matter how vast, can physically occupy every world, monitor every transaction, or patrol every route. There will always be places where presence is thin, where authority is weak, and where people can do what they want without anyone watching. The Empire had ships to win battles, but not the relationships to hold territory. Real control requires networks of trust and cooperation. People who report suspicious activity because they want to, because they believe in the system, because they see themselves as part of it. Local leaders who enforce order because they share its goals, not because someone is watching them. Communities that work with authorities rather than against them. Imperial leadership replaced all of this with watching and monitoring, which is slower, more expensive, and full of gaps that determined enemies can find. Smugglers use remote routes through unexplored space that no patrol fleet could cover. Friendly systems looked the other way when rebel ships passed through. Black markets moved weapons and supplies without leaving a trace in any Imperial database. Safe houses operated on worlds considered completely under control, sometimes for years before anyone noticed. Effective governance at this scale requires willing cooperation from populations who believe the government deserves support, or at least that cooperation serves their own interests. Palpatine's regime had neither. It demanded obedience through fear, which meant constantly showing its capacity for harm. But showing force everywhere at once is impossible. Imperial forces could be terrifying on Alderaan while being absent on Lothal. They could crush resistance on one world while resistance grew on 100 others. They could win every battle that mattered to leadership while losing countless small struggles that didn't seem important until they added up. The gap between Imperial reach and actual presence becomes clear on Ferrix. As depicted in Endor, order was outsourced to corporate security for years. The Primor Authority maintained control, direct military presence. There weren't enough resources to station significant forces on every world, so the work was contracted out to whoever was willing to take the job. This saved money and manpower in the short term. In the long term, it created exactly the kind of gaps the rebellion used. Locals on Ferrix developed their own traditions, their own networks, and their own ways of communicating that excluded outsiders. A community formed that outsiders couldn't see into, growing stronger year by year. When stormtroopers finally arrived in force, they discovered bonds of loyalty that had been forming for years. The community closed ranks, and the heavy-handed response only confirmed everything the locals had suspected about Imperial rule. The gaps were everywhere, and the rebellion found them all. Imperial governance ran on sameness. Every system had to conform to the same templates, the same procedures, the same reports. Coruscant made the galaxy easier to govern on paper. A governor on the Outer Rim filled out the same forms as a governor in the core, but that sameness came at a cost. Standardized reports couldn't capture what was actually happening on the ground. Local knowledge was erased, local solutions were forbidden, and one-size-fits-all approaches replaced anything that worked. The Empire could see what it had made readable. It could not see what it had made invisible. This inability to hold what was conquered might have been manageable if all the parts worked together. Instead, those parts spent as much energy fighting each other as fighting the rebellion. The Empire was a nest of competing power centers. Navy against the Army, ISB against Imperial intelligence, Moffs against each other, everyone against the Sith priorities that seemed to override military logic whenever Vader or the Emperor got involved. Personal ambition created waste, territory disputes, and drained resources that should have gone towards fighting the actual enemy. The rebels didn't just fight the Empire, they let the Empire fight itself. Palpatine deliberately encouraged this internal conflict. Keeping subordinates fighting each other meant that they couldn't unite against him. If the Navy, the ISB, Imperial intelligence, and the Moffs were all competing for resources and influence, none could gather enough power to threaten his position. His safety required their conflict. A unified Imperial military might start having ideas about who should really be in charge. Divide and rule is an ancient strategy. Palpatine used it masterfully, but divide and rule has costs that add up over time. An organization whose parts compete with each other cannot work together effectively. Information one part has isn't shared because information is power. Strategies that would benefit the whole are resisted by parts that would lose their standing. Energy that should go towards fighting enemies goes towards fighting colleagues. The Imperial Navy was a prestige service, focused on massive ships and overwhelming firepower. Navy officers often dismissed the demands of irregular conflict as beneath their dignity. Chasing rebel cells through backwater systems wasn't glorious work. It didn't lead to promotions. It didn't earn medals. The Imperial Security Bureau competed with Imperial intelligence for resources, authority, and credit. Each organization had its own culture, its own priorities, and its own definition of success. And those definitions often conflicted. The Moff system created regional governors who put their own sectors above galactic strategy. A Moff who sent his best ships to help a neighboring sector was weakening his own position. A Moff who kept those ships at home even when they were needed elsewhere, was protecting his territory. The system rewarded selfishness, but nowhere was this infighting more damaging than in the Empire's most important project. This dysfunction reaches its peak in Rogue One with the rivalry between Director Krennic and Grand Moff Tarkin. Krennic spends years bringing the Death Star from concept to reality. He recruits Galen Erso, manages the construction, solves countless engineering problems, and keeps the project secret despite its massive scale. When the station nears completion, he expects to reap the rewards. This is his achievement, his path to greater standing, and his moment. Tarkin has other ideas. He sees the Death Star as the key to controlling the galaxy, and he intends to be the one holding that key. The rivalry between them weakens security in ways that prove fatal. Both men are so focused on getting credit that they take risks a unified command would never have taken. The test firing at Jeddah City, which attracts rebel attention and sets in motion the events that led to the theft of the Death Star plans, is driven partly by Krennic's need to show his project's capabilities before Tarkin can claim control. He needs proof that the station works. He needs something to show the Emperor. He needs to establish himself as the man who made this possible before Tarkin edges him out. When rebel agents land on Scarif to steal the Death Star plans, Tarkin's response is telling. He orders the Death Star to fire on the Imperial facility, eliminating the base, the rebels, and Krennic along with them. He justifies this as a military necessity. The plans cannot be allowed to escape, but the decision also conveniently removes his rival under circumstances that cannot be questioned. Internal politics influence tactical decisions even at the most critical moment. The Krennic-Tarkin rivalry destroyed careers, but the Emperor's treatment of its best strategists reveals something even worse. The political cost of capability becomes clear in the Thrawn novels. Grand Admiral Thrawn should have been the Empire's greatest asset, a strategic genius who won virtually every engagement he commanded. His understanding of enemy tactics, his ability to find weaknesses, and his creative approach to problems that stumped regular officers should have made him invaluable. Instead, he was a constant source of political problems. His unconventional methods frustrated superiors who wanted things done by the book. His success made rivals look bad by comparison. His honesty about military matters, his unwillingness to tell superiors what they wanted to hear, and his habit of pointing out flaws in plans proposed by people with more political power all made him enemies. The Empire didn't just ignore its best commanders, it actively drove them out. Officers who put winning conflicts over winning political contests found themselves pushed aside. The Empire became an organization led by politicians in uniform rather than warriors. The people at the top were there because they had mastered the internal game, not because they were good at fighting actual enemies. Every failure traced back to a single source: the man who built the Empire and the purpose he built it to serve. The Empire was built to serve Palpatine, not to function without him. He wanted control, not peace. Every flaw in the system traced back to that single priority: the enemies, the blindness, the rigid command structure, the superweapons, the infighting. All of it served one purpose: keeping Palpatine in charge. None of these were accidents or failures of execution. They were the design. The Empire was working exactly as Palpatine intended. It just wasn't designed to work for anyone else. Palpatine rose to power through the crisis. The Clone Wars gave him emergency powers that a peacetime chancellor would never have received. The Jedi threat, manufactured by Palpatine himself, gave him the justification to reorganize the Republic into an empire with himself as absolute ruler. He understood that the crisis was the source of his authority, and he never intended to let it end. The Galactic Civil War was not an obstacle to Palpatine's rule, it was an instrument. A low-level resistance that could never quite be stamped out served his purposes perfectly. It justified military spending that kept officers dependent on his favor. It justified watching and monitoring that let him track potential rivals. It justified stripping away rights that might have shielded anyone who spoke against him. It justified the concentration of power that made him indispensable. Without the rebellion, ambitious subordinates might have turned their attention towards the throne itself. Peace was a threat to Palpatine's power in a way that the rebellion never was. The Empire could not defeat the rebellion because defeating it was never really the goal. Imperial structures consistently put Palpatine's control over lasting stability. The system wasn't designed to win, it was designed to maintain his grip on power. When real stress came, when pressure built to levels he hadn't expected, the system had failed exactly as it was built to fail. Admiral Gallius Rax, entrusted with executing Operation Cinder after Endor, understood this perfectly. The empire that ordinary Imperials served and believed in, the empire of order and stability and protection, was a fiction. It was merely a vehicle for Palpatine's larger ambitions, a tool to be used and discarded. When the tool was no longer useful, when Palpatine was gone, and the Empire could no longer serve his purposes, it was to be thrown away. Rax didn't question the order, he carried it out, because he knew what the Emperor really was. He had always known. The soldiers who gave their lives at Jakku, believing they were defending their civilization, were actually sacrifices to a dead man's spite. They fought and perished for an empire that had already been scheduled for elimination by its own creator. The officers who led them into that final battle knew the war was lost. Some fought anyway out of loyalty, others fought because they had nothing left. None of them understood that the empire they were dying for had never been meant to outlive the man who built it. For 24 years, these failures built pressure beneath the surface. Then came Endor, and everything came apart at once. The Battle of Endor wasn't the cause of Imperial collapse, it was simply the moment the mask came off, when every structural weakness that had been building for 24 years became visible at once. The Emperor fell, and there was nothing underneath him. No legitimate succession, no adaptable institutions, no populations who believed in what the Empire stood for. Only Operation Cinder, the final command of someone who would rather burn the galaxy than let it exist without him. The rebels didn't defeat the Empire, they outlasted it. And that was enough. The largest military force of its era tore itself apart more thoroughly than any external enemy ever could. Fear held the galaxy together for 24 years, but fear was all the Empire ever had. When it ran out, so did everything else. The Empire's collapse left scars across the galaxy, but one Jedi Master survived to witness every failure firsthand from the shadows.